Chapter 1. Predictable isn't the same as safe. Richard Evers had always considered himself fortunate. At 33, married 4 years, together for 6, employed in a job that rarely followed him home. He was living the kind of life people aspired to without saying so out loud. Predictable, sure. But predictable didn't mean stagnant. He and Emily had systems. Evenings were theirs. Phones stayed face down on the counter. Dinner was shared, even if it was takeout eaten from mismatched bowls. They talked about work, about nothing, about ideas that evaporated as soon as they said them aloud. They laughed easily. They slept better knowing the other was there. It had worked for years, which was why the changes stood out. At first, the texts were infrequent. A buzz during dinner. Emily would glance down, frown in concentration, then put the phone away with an apologetic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sorry, she'd say. Just work. Richard accepted it because it was reasonable. He worked in systems analytics for a data storage company. He knew deadlines crept. Client emergencies happened. There was no part of him that wanted to be suspicious or transactional with the woman he loved. But patterns mattered to analysts. Once or twice a week became every few days. Every few days became nightly. The buzz stretched later, sliding from after dinner to the edge of bedtime. Emily began keeping her phone closer. Not secretively, just attentively, like it might wander off if she didn't keep a thumb hooked around it. The moment that lodged in his chest happened quietly. They were in bed, lights off, sheets cool. They'd been talking, really talking, about whether they should start thinking seriously about kids next year or the year after. Emily had turned toward him, propped on one elbow, her expression thoughtful. Then his phone buzzed. Not his. He glanced at the clock out of habit. 10:56 p.m. Emily rolled onto her back, picked up her phone, and smiled at the screen. Not a polite smile, not a neutral one, something small and private. Who's texting so late? Richard asked, keeping his voice conversational. Just work, she said easily, already typing. He waited. She finished a reply, then another. She put the phone down, leaned over, kissed him, and switched off the lamp. Richard lay awake longer than usual, listening to her breathing even out, wondering when just work had started to feel like a separate room he didn't have keys to. The monthly luncheon at Emily's company arrived in early spring. Spouses were invited. Richard almost didn't go, until he realized that avoidance wouldn't answer anything. They arrived early. Assigned seating, linen tablecloths, forced cheer. Emily introduced him around as they sat. Richard shook hands with people whose faces he might forget but whose posture told stories. Then she said, "This is Kevin." Kevin had a handshake that lingered half a beat too long and a voice that assumed attention. He wore confidence like cologne, liberally, unnecessarily. He leaned closer to Emily than required and began talking as though Richard wasn't there. Richard noticed Emily didn't push back. As lunch unfolded, Kevin monopolized her attention, leaning in, laughing too loudly, touching her forearm once, casually, like it was nothing. Richard found himself talking to Emily's manager instead. Sylvia Reynolds looked to be in her early 50s, silver-haired and unbothered. She had the expression of someone who didn't confuse urgency with importance. They talked about the company, the food, corporate nonsense. Then Richard asked, mildly, "Can I ask you something off the record?" She raised an eyebrow, amused. "You already are. My wife's been getting work texts late at night for months now. After 10. Sometimes later. Is that normal here?" Sylvia blinked. Then she frowned, not defensively, but genuinely confused. "No," she said slowly. "We don't expect people to work off the clock unless there's an emergency. And that's rare." Richard nodded, absorbing the confirmation. She followed his gaze briefly to Emily, laughing at something Kevin said. Then Sylvia leaned in, lowering her voice. "If they're talking that late, it has nothing to do with work." He thanked her, honestly, and sat very still. Richard didn't feel rage. Rage was unfocused. This was clarity. He turned toward Emily's end of the table and waited for a pause that never came. So he created one. "Kevin," he said. The table quieted instantly. Kevin turned. Emily froze. "Are you married?" Kevin blinked, caught off guard, then smiled. "No, haven't found the one yet." "That's reasonable," Richard said, nodding. Then he smiled, but there was no friendliness in it. "So why is a single man spending so much time texting my wife at night? Are you interviewing her?" Emily gasped. Kevin sputtered something that might have been an explanation if it had finished forming. Richard raised a hand. Calm, decisive. "The next time you text my wife," he said evenly, "I'm going to come to your home, and we're going to have a very private conversation about boundaries." Silence. Thick. Public. Richard stood, thanked Sylvia for the hospitality, put on his jacket, and walked out. He didn't look back. He didn't believe Emily was cheating, but he knew she'd been lying, and that was close enough to matter. If Emily wanted to keep the life they were building, she was going to have to choose it, because Richard Evers was nobody's option. Chapter 2. The silence after the applause. The apartment felt different without Emily in it. Richard noticed it the moment he closed the door behind him, not because the space was unfamiliar, but because it was too familiar. Every piece of furniture was exactly where it always was. The couch still had the faint indentation where Emily liked to sit with her legs tucked under her. Her shoes were by the entryway, perfectly aligned, as if she were merely in the other room. He set his keys down slowly, deliberately, the sound too loud in the quiet. He hadn't stormed out of the luncheon with adrenaline pumping or anger clouding his judgment. The clarity he'd felt there had followed him home, steady and sober. It hummed beneath his skin like a resolved equation, one that didn't require further testing. He loosened his tie, folded his jacket over the back of a chair, and sat at the small kitchen table they'd bought their second year together because neither of them liked eating on the couch for more than one night in a row. They had rules, habits, agreements, which made the waiting harder. Emily came home 47 minutes later. Richard didn't check his watch, but his mind marked the time anyway. The door opened quietly. She stepped inside as if the air might shatter if she moved too fast. Her coat stayed on. Her purse hung from her shoulder like a shield. When she saw him at the table, she froze. "Rich," she said, his name careful, tentative. "Emily," he answered evenly. She dropped her purse onto the counter and sat across from him, folding her hands together so tightly her knuckles blanched. "I didn't know how to leave," she said. Everyone was staring. "Kevin, stop," Richard interrupted, not sharply, but conclusively. "If we're going to talk, we're not starting with Kevin." She swallowed. "Okay." They sat in silence for a moment. Not the comfortable kind, the kind that demanded something from both of them. "I embarrassed you," she said finally. "And I embarrassed myself." "Yes," Richard replied. "You did." Her eyes filled instantly. "That's it? That's all you're going to say?" "No," he said. "That's just the part one won't argue about." She let out a shaky breath. "I wasn't cheating. I didn't say you were. But you implied—" "I implied that you were lying to me," he said. "And that another man was crossing lines you let him cross." She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "It wasn't like that." Richard leaned back slightly, folding his arms. "Then explain it to me like it wasn't." Emily's shoulders slumped. She stared down at the table. "Kevin's intense. He's good at his job. He's persuasive. It started out with him asking questions about projects, then venting, then joking. Felt harmless. When the texts started getting later?" "Yes." She hesitated. "Around then." Richard nodded. "And when did you decide not to tell me the truth about it?" Her eyes snapped up. "I didn't, Emily." She exhaled hard. "When I realized you wouldn't like it." Silence again. This one landed heavy. "So you knew it crossed a boundary," he said quietly. She nodded, barely. "That's the problem," Richard continued. "Not Kevin. Not attraction. Not ego. You made a choice not to include me in my own marriage." Tears slid down her cheeks. "I liked feeling noticed." The honesty startled him. Not because he hadn't suspected it, but because she said it plainly, without dramatics. "You've always noticed me," she rushed to add. "You still do." "I have never questioned that," he said. "But that's not the same thing." Her fingers twisted together. It felt easy. No stakes. No consequences. Richard gave a humorless laugh. "That should have been your first warning sign." She winced. "I'm not interested in policing you," he went on. "I'm not your warden. But I am your husband. And I will not share that role, implicitly or otherwise." Emily wiped at her face. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to tell me the truth," Richard said. "All of it. Not the version that makes this easier." She nodded, sniffing. "When Kevin texted, I didn't stop it because confronting it would have made it real. And because part of me liked that someone at work thought everything I said mattered." Richard considered that. Then he said, "That part of you is human. The part that hid it, that's the part we have to deal with." She nodded again, smaller this time. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends," Richard said. "On what?" Hovered unspoken between them. "I told Kevin not to contact you again," Emily said quickly. "I blocked his number on the way home." "That's a start," Richard said. "But it doesn't fix trust. It doesn't rewind the last few months." She squeezed her hands together. "I know." Richard stood and went to the sink, not to escape, but because his body needed movement. He poured 2 glasses of water and brought one back to the table, setting it in front of her. "That wasn't me punishing you," he said. "It was me staying in the room." Her eyebrows knit together. "You don't feel like you're staying." "I am," he said. "But I'm not pretending this didn't happen." Emily let out a shaky laugh through her tears. "So what, do we divorce? Over texts?" "No," Richard said immediately. "But we don't minimize it either." She nodded, staring into her glass. "We were talking about kids," she said softly. "About starting a family." "I know. And then I did this." "You didn't cheat," he repeated. "But you stepped halfway onto a bridge you didn't intend to cross." Intent doesn't erase proximity. She looked at him, then really looked at him. "Are you leaving?" He shook his head. "No. But I'm not absorbing this quietly." "What does that mean?" "It means we talk to someone," Richard said. Together. A counselor. Someone neutral. She looked relieved and ashamed all at once. You'd really do that? Yes, because I'd rather repair something while it's damaged than pretend it never cracked. Emily nodded slowly. Okay. He sat back down. Their knees brushed accidentally under the table, then deliberately remained touching. There's something else, he added. She braced. What? You don't get to frame this as something that happened to you, he said. You weren't swept away. You made decisions, small ones, daily ones. We name them, or we repeat them. She swallowed. I understand. They sat together in the quiet apartment, the reality of what had almost happened hanging between them, not as a threat, but as a warning. Later that night, they lay on opposite sides of the bed, hands not quite touching. It wasn't cold. It was honest. And for the first time since the texts began, Richard slept without pretending something wasn't wrong. Trust, he knew, wasn't rebuilt with apologies. It was rebuilt with presence. Chapter 3. Consequences don't need to announce themselves. By Monday morning, the luncheon had already become something else. Not a scandal, those burned hot and brief, but a narrative. The kind that traveled quietly through hallways and email threads, stripped of emotional context and reduced to bullet point memory. Single male coworker. Married woman. Public confrontation. Manager present. Richard knew this because Emily told him, not defensively, not dramatically, but with the weary awareness of someone realizing that choices left footprints even when you wiped your shoes. They're not saying anything outright, she said over breakfast, staring into her coffee as if it might reorganize itself if she waited long enough. But people are careful. Careful with you? Richard asked. Careful around Kevin, she corrected. He's suddenly less magnetic. Richard almost smiled, but he didn't. This wasn't a victory. It was fallout. Emily had blocked Kevin's number. She'd shown Richard without being asked, like someone opening their hands to prove there was nothing hidden. He appreciated that, not as proof but as posture. Still, posture didn't prevent aftermath. At 11:30 that morning, Emily texted him. Sylvia asked to meet with me, one-on-one, this afternoon. Richard stared at his phone for a moment, then typed back. Okay, I'm here tonight regardless. He meant it. Sylvia Reynolds didn't raise her voice. Emily would later say that was the most unnerving part. They sat in her office, neatly arranged, intentionally unthreatening. Sunlight on framed photos. No closed blinds. No HR representative hovering. Emily, Sylvia said, hands folded neatly on her desk. I need to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Emily nodded, shoulders tight. Has Kevin ever instructed you to work outside regular hours? No, Emily said immediately. Never. Did you imply that he had? Emily hesitated. I don't know that I implied it. I didn't correct the assumption. Sylvia sighed. Not exasperated, but disappointed. Silence functions as agreement more often than people realize. Emily lowered her gaze. I also need you to understand, Sylvia continued, that Kevin has now created a professional liability for himself, not only because of the personal element, but because he used work as cover. Emily's stomach dropped. I didn't think. I know, Sylvia said gently. That's the issue. When Emily came home that evening, she looked like someone who had aged several months in a single afternoon. Richard didn't ask how it went. He set 2 plates on the table and waited. They reassigned him, Emily said eventually. Different team, different floor. Richard nodded. Temporary? No, she said. Permanent. She waited for judgment, for satisfaction. Neither came. I didn't ask for that, Emily added quickly. I know, Richard said. But actions don't stay contained just because we wish they would. She laughed weakly. You're very calm about this. I'm choosing to be, he replied. That night, Kevin tried another route. He didn't text Emily. He emailed Richard. The message was short, carefully worded, inappropriately familiar. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I never meant any disrespect. I'd like to clear the air. Richard read it once, then again. Then he deleted it. There was no misunderstanding worth clarifying. Kevin wasn't confused, he was uncomfortable. And discomfort had a way of motivating apologies that weren't about remorse so much as restoration of status. Richard had no interest in restoring anything Kevin had lost. Over the next few days, things settled into an uneasy normal. Emily worked. Richard worked. They shared dinners, but conversation stayed purposeful, almost scripted. Not cold, just careful not to wander into emotional shortcuts. On Thursday evening, Richard watched Emily pause before placing her phone face down on the counter. I'm not doing it to prove anything, she said quietly. I just want that to be normal again. He nodded. Intent matters. Consistency more. She smiled faintly. You're really not letting me minimize this, are you? No, Richard said, not unkindly. Because minimizing is how we got here. She leaned against the counter. You're not angry. That scares me a little. That's fair, he said. Anger would be simpler. This requires attention. Later that night, he lay awake beside her. Not distant, but alert. He thought about the version of himself that might have shouted or sulked or demanded reassurance through control. That man would have felt righteous. This version felt steadier. Kevin attempted a social recovery through mutual acquaintances. It didn't take. Men like Kevin survived on being admired. Indifference was worse than confrontation. It starved the performance. By Friday, his name stopped circulating. People moved on. Emily didn't. Neither did Richard. Saturday morning, they sat across from each other at the kitchen table again, mirroring their first serious conversation days earlier. I called a counselor, Emily said, fingers wrapped around her mug. Appointments open next week. Richard nodded. Good. I don't expect this to just reset, she added. I know trust doesn't work like that. No, he agreed. It works like a muscle. You strain it, you don't pretend it's fine. You rehabilitate it. She smiled sadly. You'd be very annoying to lie to. Consider that my charm, he said. She reached across the table, tentative, and rested her hand over his. He didn't pull away. Outside, life continued its oblivious rhythm. Cars passed. A neighbor argued on the phone. Someone laughed. Inside, something essential was shifting. Not dramatically, not romantically, but deliberately. Temptation, Richard thought, was loud. Consequences were quieter. And commitment, the real kind, rarely needed a witness. Chapter 4. Talking to a stranger about each other. The waiting room smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and old books. Richard noticed this because he noticed everything when he was mildly uncomfortable and determined not to show it. Emily sat beside him on the small couch, knees together, hands folded in her lap. Not withdrawn, not clinging, present in the careful way of someone who didn't want to get anything wrong. Therapy, Richard had decided, was not something you eased into gracefully. You showed up or you didn't. You spoke or you wasted everyone's time. The door opened. Emily and Richard? A woman asked, smiling. She was in her early 40s, maybe. Calm eyes, sensible shoes. Nothing about her said, I will fix you, which Richard appreciated. I'm Dr. Lila Morgan. Come on in. The office was softly lit, neutral but not sterile. 3 chairs angled toward one another. A box of tissues placed within easy reach but not pushed forward like a suggestion. They sat. Lila crossed one leg over the other. Before we start, I want to set a couple of expectations. This isn't about assigning blame. It is about accountability. And we don't rush past discomfort just because silence feels more polite. Richard nodded once. Emily nodded twice. Good, Lila said. So, who wants to start by telling me why you're here? Emily inhaled, then stopped herself. Richard spoke first. I don't want what almost happened to actually happen, he said plainly. And I don't want us to pretend it didn't almost happen. Lila turned to Emily. Does that align with your understanding? Yes, Emily said immediately. I crossed emotional boundaries. I didn't cheat, but I lied. And I don't want to do that again. Lila studied them both for a moment. Let's talk about the lie first, she said. Not the content, the reason. Emily tensed. Why? Lila continued gently. Did you choose silence over honesty? Emily swallowed. Because honesty would have forced me to confront the fact that I liked the attention. And that made me feel disloyal. To whom? Lila asked. Emily blinked. To Richard. And to yourself? Lila added. Emily hesitated, then nodded. Richard hadn't expected that part. Something in his chest shifted slightly, like pressure redistributing. Lila glanced between them. Richard, what did the lying mean to you? It meant I wasn't part of the decision-making anymore, he said after a moment. It meant something was happening in my marriage that I wasn't allowed to see. Emily flinched. That landed, Lila observed. Yes, Emily said quietly. That's important, Lila said, because the issue here isn't temptation. Temptation happens in long-term relationships. The issue is exclusion. Emily frowned faintly. I didn't think of it like that. Most people don't, Lila replied. Which is why it keeps happening. There was a pause, then Lila smiled lightly. Let's talk logistics. Humor me for a moment. How do evenings usually look for you? Richard described their routine. Phones down, dinner together, shared time. As he spoke, he realized how much he'd relied on habit as evidence of health. And when those habits changed? Lila asked. I noticed, Richard said. But I assumed that noticing was the same as addressing. Emily let out a soft, rueful laugh. I noticed and assumed not asking was the same as protecting him. Lila nodded. Ah, parallel misinterpretations. What do we do with that? Emily asked. You interrupted, Lila said. Earlier, loudly, with awkward conversations. Richard smiled faintly. We're very good at awkward, it turns out. Emily glanced at him, startled, then smiled back. It was small, genuine. That, Lila said, pointing lightly between them, is a resource. They talked for nearly an hour. Not dramatically, methodically. They named patterns without dramatizing them. Emily talked about feeling invisible at work before Kevin's attention. Richard talked about assuming silence meant things were fine because they usually were. At the end, Lila stood. I'd like you to do something simple this week, she said. Reintroduce intentionality. One evening. Phones off. Not to fix anything, just to observe each other. Emily nodded eagerly. Richard nodded thoughtfully. Outside, they walked in silence for a few steps. I liked her, Emily said finally. So did I, Richard agreed. She didn't let either of us off the hook. That was the idea, Emily said. That evening, their intentional night didn't look glamorous. They ordered pizza. They sat on the floor because the couch was suddenly too familiar. They talked about mundane things, work deadlines, a leaking faucet, whether they should replace the coffee maker. Felt strange. Like dating without the benefit of mystery. At one point, Emily laughed unexpectedly. This feels very earnest. It is earnest, Richard said. We're 33 and married. Subtlety had a good run. She leaned against his shoulder. This time he leaned back too. A few days later, Emily faced her first quiet test. She was in the elevator at work when Kevin stepped inside. The doors closed. There were two other people present. No confrontation. No apology. Kevin nodded stiffly. Emily. Kevin, she replied, neutral. Civil. He didn't speak again. When the doors opened, she exhaled for the first time in 15 seconds. That evening, she told Richard about it without hesitation. I didn't do anything, she finished, almost apologetic. You did, Richard said. You included me. She smiled, relief washing over her features. Later, lying in bed, Emily turned to him. I used to think boundaries were about other people, she said. Now I think they're mostly about honesty. That's been my experience, Richard replied. She reached for his hand. This time there was no pause. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent and steady. Inside, two people were doing quieter, harder work, choosing each other without assumption, without theater. Romance, Richard thought, was no longer about surprise. It was about showing up where no one was watching. And for the first time in weeks, that felt like more than enough. Chapter 5. Relearning each other without the apologies. The first date happened on a Wednesday, which Emily insisted made it either very responsible or very suspicious. No one chooses Wednesday on purpose, she said, standing in front of the mirror, tugging at the hem of her dress. It feels like lying to myself about spontaneity. Richard leaned against the doorframe, watching her with a fond attention he hadn't quite trusted himself with yet. We chose Wednesday because the counselor said intentionality mattered, and Thursday is trash night. Emily laughed despite herself. Romance is dead. Romance, Richard corrected, has a chore calendar. They didn't dress up much. That felt wrong, performative in a way neither of them wanted right now. Emily wore a green dress she usually reserved for brunches with friends. Richard wore a jacket he'd had so long it no longer counted as effort. They walked to a neighborhood restaurant they'd passed 100 times but never entered, one of those places that existed slightly outside your awareness until one day it became useful. Inside, the lighting was warm and unpretentious. No loud music, no televisions mounted in accusation. Just tables, food, and the quiet understanding that people were there to be with each other. They sat across from one another and really looked, in that way married couples often forgot to do once they'd mastered the art of proximity. Well, Emily said, folding her napkin carefully, this is weird. Yes, Richard agreed, but not bad weird. No, she said, more like unfamiliar familiar. He smiled. Our specialty. The waiter arrived and left them with menus and no urgency. They made small talk at first, safe things. The weather had opinions, the city was loud again now that spring thought it was winning. Then Emily lowered her menu and said, I realized something this week. Richard set his down as well. I used to think feeling close meant feeling comfortable, she said. But I got comfortable assuming we'd always know what the other meant. And we stopped clarifying, Richard said, recognizing the shape of the thought. She nodded. I didn't want to bother you with something I hadn't figured out yet. And I didn't want to bother you by asking questions that sounded insecure, he said. They shared a quiet smile. Turns out, Emily added, those were the exact questions we needed. Dinner arrived. It was good, not life-changing, but honest. The kind of meal you enjoyed without narrating. Halfway through, Emily frowned thoughtfully. Can I ask you something without it turning into a therapy recap? Richard considered. I think so, but if I start using metaphors, pull the plug. Deal. She took a sip of water. When you confronted Kevin, why didn't you yell? Richard blinked. That's what you're curious about? Yes, she said. Everyone expected you to explode. I wanted him to understand that I wasn't competing, Richard said. Anger would have centered him. Silence didn't. Emily stared at him for a moment. That's unervingly effective. I aim to unsettle. They walked home afterward, the city buzzing around them. On a corner they'd crossed together thousands of times. Emily stopped. Rich. Yes. I don't feel like we're recovering anymore, she said slowly. It feels like we're rebuilding differently. He thought about it. I think recovery implies returning to a previous state. That state wasn't as solid as we thought. She nodded. I don't want to be the version of myself that almost settled for attention instead of connection. I don't want to be the version of myself who mistakes routine for presence, he replied. At home, they didn't rush. They made tea. They sat on opposite ends of the couch. Not emotionally distant, just attentive to space, like architects mapping a new room. Emily glanced at him. Do you miss us? The before us? Richard shook his head. I miss thinking certainty was effortless. I don't miss the blind spots. She smiled, leaning back. Good. Because I don't think I could unlearn this even if I wanted to. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm that was deliberately uneven. They planned dates like analysts scheduling experiments, trying new restaurants, revisiting old haunts with fresh eyes. Sometimes it was great. Sometimes it was awkward in a way that reminded them they were more comfortable than curious. They talked more. About work stresses they'd minimized before. About resentment that hadn't turned bitter, but had quietly accumulated like dust. One Friday night, they found themselves laughing on the kitchen floor after a recipe went catastrophically wrong. This didn't used to be fun, Emily said, wiping tears from her eyes. No, Richard agreed. We used to blame the recipe. She leaned against him, still smiling. I like this better. So do I. Kevin became a ghost, present only as a cautionary footnote in conversations with Lila and the occasional office rumor Emily brought home without embellishment. It's strange, she said once. I don't miss the attention. I miss the version of myself that thought it meant something. Richard nodded. We all outgrow identities. One evening, weeks later, Emily came home late, genuinely late, with a calendar invite and receipts to match. She told Richard immediately, unprompted. I had to stay for a client issue, she said. I didn't want you to wonder. I didn't, Richard replied honestly. But I appreciate that you said it anyway. She smiled, relieved. Inclusion feels safer than secrecy. That night, they lay side by side, not touching, but aligned. Emily turned her head toward him. Do you still want to think about kids? Richard smiled softly. I want to think about us, not avoiding the question. She considered that, then laughed quietly. That sounds like you. I'm trying to be consistent. She reached for his hand. This time, there was no hesitation at all. Their life hadn't become dramatic or cinematic. It had become intentional. And somewhere between bad dinners, uncomfortable honesty, and Wednesday night dates, they realized something quietly remarkable. They weren't surviving a mistake. They were choosing each other again, this time with both eyes open. Chapter 6. A trial run nobody signed up for. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, right as Richard was closing a spreadsheet he'd already checked twice and no longer trusted. Hey, his sister Anna said without preamble. What are you doing this weekend? Richard paused. Experience suggested this question rarely preceded something easy. I was planning to exist quietly, he said. Why? A beat. Then, with the breezy confidence of someone about to disrupt a carefully calibrated life, she said, Great. I need a favor. The favor turned out to be a Saturday overnight with her two children, 6-year-old Ben and 4-year-old Lucy. Because her childcare had collapsed, her husband was out of state, and she had a work obligation she couldn't reschedule. Emily, listening from the other room, raised her eyebrows when Richard repeated the request. You don't have to, she said immediately, already scanning his expression for strain. He considered it. The timing was inconvenient. The implications were louder than usual. But he surprised himself by saying, We can do it. Anna exhaled audibly through the phone. You're a lifesaver. I'll drop them off at 10. They ended the call. Emily stared at him. You realize what this is, she said slowly. A logistical nightmare? Richard offered. A highly concentrated exposure, Emily countered, to all the things we keep talking around. He nodded. Yes, that too. Saturday morning arrived with chaos. Ben burst through the door like a contained explosion. Lucy dragged a stuffed rabbit nearly as large as her torso, announcing that it didn't like loud noises, vegetables, or strangers. Richard watched Emily kneel to greet them, her voice warm and calm in a way that felt both familiar and newly revealing. The day unraveled quickly. Breakfast negotiations, spilled juice, a tantrum about socks being too sock-like. Emily handled it with practiced patience. Richard followed instructions, fetched towels, Googled, how long is too long for a timeout, with the discreet intensity of someone studying for an exam he hadn't prepared for. By noon, the apartment no longer looked like a place adults lived. They took the kids to the park. Emily pushed Lucy on the swings. Richard jogged awkwardly after Ben, who had decided running in erratic patterns was a valid game. Somewhere between a scraped knee and a philosophical debate about why pigeons couldn't be pets, Richard felt the weight of the experience settle into his shoulders. This wasn't symbolic. This was operational. Late that afternoon, while Ben built a block tower and Lucy narrated an elaborate story involving her rabbit, Emily leaned against the counter beside Richard. You're quiet, she observed. Thinking, he said. That's never vague. He smiled faintly. I'm realizing timelines are less linear than I thought. Meaning, I've always said I didn't want to be 60 at a high school graduation, he said. But what I meant was, I didn't want to be tired, or disconnected, or going through the motions. Emily studied him. And now I'm realizing readiness isn't about age, he said. It's about whether the structure underneath you can handle expansion. Her expression softened. What do you think about ours? He hesitated, then spoke carefully. It's sturdier than it was a few months ago. She smiled, not defensively, not anxiously. Just honest agreement. I think so too. That evening, dinner was loud, messy, and entirely without elegance. Lucy fell asleep on the couch mid-sentence. Ben asked 17 follow-up questions about brushing teeth. Richard carried Lucy to the guest bed with an unfamiliar tenderness that surprised him in its specificity. Not abstract, not hypothetical, immediate. Later, after both kids were asleep and the apartment was quiet again, Richard sat on the floor, back against the couch. Emily joined him, handing him a glass of water like a peace offering. That was a lot, she said. Yes, he agreed. She glanced sideways at him. Did it scare you? He considered the question in its entirety. Yes, he said finally. But not away. She nodded. Same. They didn't reach for each other immediately. They simply existed in the aftermath. Tired, aware, unshielded by plans or theories. The next morning, Anna arrived early, apologies ready and unnecessary. The kids departed in the same energetic chaos they'd arrived, leaving behind a scattering of toys and a heavier quiet. Emily stood in the kitchen, surveying the aftermath. We should clean. In a minute, Richard said, sitting at the table. She joined him. Neither spoke at first. Then Emily said, I don't feel like we're rehearsing anymore. Richard smiled slightly. I was thinking that on the swings. This didn't feel like a test. It felt like practice. Is there a difference? Yes, he said. Tests you take alone. Practice implies repetition and support. She reached across the table, resting her hand over his. I like how literal you get when things matter. He squeezed her hand once. I like how honest you are lately, even when it's inconvenient. She laughed softly. Especially then. They cleaned the apartment together, quietly, efficiently. It wasn't celebratory. It wasn't somber. It was simply shared. That night, lying in bed, Emily turned to him. I don't need answers right away, she said. About kids, or timing, or anything. I know, he replied. But I don't want us to avoid the questions either. I don't either, Richard said. Avoiding has a way of sneaking back disguised as peace. She smiled. You're very irritatingly correct about things. I contain multitudes. They lay in the dark, hands loosely intertwined. Not gripping, not tentative. Steady. The weekend hadn't decided anything for them. It had clarified something more useful. They weren't talking about a future in theory anymore. They were building one with their eyes open, aware of the mess, the effort, the unexpected weight, and choosing to stay in the room anyway. And somehow, that choice felt less frightening than it ever had before. Chapter 7. The quiet choice. Emily didn't notice the test at first. That was the dangerous part. Not that it appeared loudly or dramatically, but that it arrived folded into the ordinary shape of a weekday. It began with a meeting that ran late. Not unusually late, just past 6. The kind of delay that came with end-of-quarter pressure and polite apologies. When it finally ended, Emily gathered her things and checked her phone as she walked toward the elevator. There was a new message request. Not Kevin. Someone else from her department, Aaron. A recent hire she'd helped onboard months ago. Capable, friendly, unremarkable in the way most people were until proven otherwise. Hey, sorry to bother you so late. Had a question about the client summary. Figured I'd ask while it's fresh. Emily stopped walking. 2 months earlier, she would have answered without thinking. She would have framed it as helpfulness, mentorship, efficiency. She would have typed while waiting for the elevator and felt quietly pleased to be thought of as indispensable. Instead, she stood still and read the words again. So late. It was only 6:42 p.m. Not 10. Not 11. Still late enough. She didn't feel flattered. She felt alert. She typed a response, then deleted it. Typed again. Then she closed the app entirely and put the phone back into her bag before the elevator arrived. At home, Richard was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, a pan hissing softly on the stove. Hey, he said, glancing over his shoulder. Dinner's halfway to edible. That's optimistic, Emily said, dropping her bag and leaning in to kiss his cheek. He took a quick breath in, the involuntary kind, and smiled. Smells like progress, then. They ate at the table, talking about inconsequential things. A vendor meltdown on Richard's end. A printer rebellion on hers. They laughed easily, something that had become more frequent over the past few weeks, like laughter had remembered it was allowed again. As Richard cleared the plates, Emily picked up her phone. He noticed but didn't comment. She sat there for a moment, then said, I want to tell you something, and I don't want it to sound bigger than it is. Richard turned toward her fully. Okay. A coworker messaged me after work, she said. About a project question. He waited. No tension. No preemptive reassurance. I didn't respond, she continued. Not because it was wrong, but because it could have become something vague if I let it. Richard watched her carefully. And you want me to know? Yes, she said. Because I don't want there to be rooms in my day that you don't exist in. He felt something settle then. Not relief, trust didn't spike like adrenaline. It deepened, quietly, like something choosing to stay. Thank you, he said. She smiled, then added, I'm going to answer it tomorrow during work hours, with other people looped in. That sounds appropriate, he said. She laughed. You say that like an HR pamphlet. I've been told I have a soothing compliance tone. They moved to the couch afterward, bodies angled toward each other, not touching at first. The quiet felt easy, not precarious or charged, just complete. Emily rested her head against his shoulder. This was oddly harder than the bigger thing, she admitted. Richard nodded. That's usually how it goes. Big lines get obvious names. Small ones get blurred. She tilted her head to look at him. You're not tired of this yet? Of what? Being aware, she said. Paying attention all the time. He thought for a moment. I think I was more tired pretending not to. She smiled at that. The next morning, Emily replied to Aaron's message thoughtfully, professionally, CCing the appropriate team lead. Nothing personal. Nothing ambiguous. Took 3 minutes and cost her nothing. Except maybe the faint loss of an identity she no longer needed. That of the person who felt validated by being needed in off-hour silence. At lunch, she texted Richard. Handled the thing. Felt clean. He replied a minute later. That's what boundaries do. That evening, they walked together through the neighborhood. Spring air cool against their jacket collars. They passed couples arguing, couples laughing, people alone on benches pretending not to notice anyone. You ever wonder how many marriages end quietly? Emily asked. All the time, Richard said. Drama makes headlines. Drift doesn't. She slowed her pace. I don't want us to drift. Then we name it when we feel it starting, he said. Even when it's boring. They stopped at the corner, traffic humming around them. Emily took his hand. I don't feel tempted anymore, she said after a pause. Not because I'm stronger. Because I don't feel unseen. He squeezed her fingers once. That's not accidental. That night, as they lay in bed, Emily reached across the space between them and rested her hand on his chest. I'm glad you didn't forgive me quickly, she said. He turned his head toward her. I wasn't withholding forgiveness. I was building something that could hold it. She smiled, eyes soft in the dim light. Trust, Emily realized, wasn't restored by grand gestures or declarations delivered at the right emotional pitch. It was rebuilt quietly, with messages not sent, rooms not closed, conversations chosen even when no one would have known otherwise. And lying there beside Richard, steady and awake, she understood something with absolute clarity. This marriage wasn't surviving temptation. It was outgrowing it. Chapter 8. Choosing the direction without needing the map. They didn't decide anything all at once. There was no dramatic conversation where one of them leaned forward and said, so this is the future, as if naming it made it obedient. Instead, the next few weeks unfolded in the way real decisions usually did, incrementally, almost quietly, through a series of small, unglamorous agreements. They kept going to therapy, not because anything was on fire, but because it wasn't. Dr. Morgan seemed pleased by this in a way she didn't bother disguising. People tend to disappear once the crisis abates, she said during one session. You've done the opposite. Richard shrugged. We discovered we're bad at pretending things don't exist. Emily smiled. It's been freeing, actually. Exhausting, but freeing. At work, life normalized. Kevin faded entirely from Emily's mental landscape. Not because he'd been replaced, but because he'd become irrelevant. She didn't measure her days by who noticed her anymore. She measured them by whether she told the truth, even when the truth was tedious or uninteresting. One evening in late spring, Richard came home with a folded piece of paper tucked into his jacket pocket. Emily noticed immediately. You look like you're hiding a riddle. I might be, he said, setting his keys down carefully. But it's not adversarial. That's disappointing, she said. I enjoy being mentally ambushed. He handed her the paper. It was a printout, plain, undecorated. Projection spreadsheet. Columns labeled time, costs, unknowns. Emily stared at it for a moment, then laughed. Is this a feasibility analysis? For a possible future, Richard replied. Not a commitment, a model. She shook her head fondly. You can't model children. I'm aware, he said. This is only to identify where the constraints are. I don't want fear buried under vagueness. She sat at the table and studied the numbers. Not because she needed convincing, but because she recognized the care behind the gesture. What made you do this? She asked. He leaned against the counter. The weekend with Anna's kids. Your honesty lately. The fact that we're no longer circling the subject like it might bite. Emily folded the paper in half again. I don't feel rushed, she said. And I don't feel stalled. Neither do I, he said. Which feels new. They talked then not about exact timelines, not about dates or guarantees, but about values. About what kind of life they wanted to make space for. about what scared them openly without apology. At one point, Emily said, "I don't need certainty. I need openness." Richard nodded. "I don't need speed. I need durability." They realized, somewhere in the middle of that conversation, that they were no longer negotiating after damage. They were planning from strength. A week later, they took a walk past an open house, one of those places that smelled like staged optimism and vanilla candles. They didn't go inside. They just paused on the sidewalk. "That could be us someday," Emily said without pressure. "Yes," Richard agreed. "And it also might not be." She smiled. "I'm okay with that. So am I." That night, lying in bed, Emily turned to him. "Do you feel like we're back to normal?" she asked. He considered it carefully. "No." Her eyebrows lifted. "Is that a bad thing?" "No," he said. "Normal assumed inertia. This feels chosen." She let that settle, then reached for his hand. "Me too," she said. "I don't want effortless love if it means unattended love." Richard squeezed her fingers. "I don't either." In the quiet that followed, there was no anxiety, no sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Just two people aware, present, unshielded by assumption. Their life didn't become louder or more impressive. It became clearer. They still forgot things. They still misunderstood each other occasionally. They still had days when work hollowed them out and dinner was eaten in tired silence. But they no longer mistook silence for safety. They spoke. They checked in. They chose transparency over convenience. One Sunday afternoon, months later, Emily raised her head from where it rested on Richard's chest and said, "You know, we're going to be okay, no matter what shape this takes." Richard smiled, not because it was reassuring, but because it was accurate. "I know," he said. "We already proved that." Their marriage hadn't been saved by confrontation or romance or fear of loss. It had been strengthened by attention, by refusing half-truths, by choosing not to leave when staying required effort. And whatever came next, children, new houses, unexpected turns, they would face it the same way they had learned to face this, together, awake, and unwilling to settle for anything less than the life they were actively building.